The Ethiopian Bible describes the one question Jesus wouldn't answer and who asked it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible has 81 books. The version most of the world reads has fewer than 73. That difference is not a translation accident. It is the record of deliberate exclusion across 4 centuries of council decisions. What survived in that gap includes a tradition of reading scripture that no Western Christian institution preserved, a framework that identifies something the Western canons left unnamed. In the Gospel accounts, there is a question that Jesus declined to answer. He did not say he could not answer it. The text is more specific than that. And the Ethiopian biblical tradition, working from its 81 books, identifies exactly who was asking. But here is what the Western reading has never been able to see. The question asked of Jesus in Matthew 24 was not new. It had been asked before. The same question, in the same essential form, appears in the oldest section of 1 Enoch, in a formal petition the Watchers sent to God through Enoch as their legal intermediary. And in the Ge'ez manuscripts held at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, Ethiopia, the formal record of that petition contains something no Western edition of Enoch has ever printed. A third element. A question about the knowledge. A question that received, in the divine proceedings Enoch describes, the same thing it received thousands of years later when someone in Judea asked it again. Silence. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the identity of the question's true asker in the Ethiopian scriptural tradition, the complete Ge'ez petition from 1 Enoch chapters 12 through 16, the unanswered third element of Azazel's petition about the transmitted knowledge, the 3 Ge'ez lines in chapter 16 that appear in no published English edition. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The Gospel of Matthew preserves the exchange at chapter 24, verse 36. Jesus has just finished describing the signs of the end, the famines, the wars, the collapse of the temple, the arrival of the Son of Man in the clouds. The disciples ask when. Jesus responds that no one knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, not the Son, but only the Father. The exchange is brief, the answer is definitive, and in the Western tradition it is read as a statement of theological humility. The Son, in his incarnate state, deferred to the Father on the question of timing. The question is asked, the response is given, the conversation moves on. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition does not read Matthew 24 to 36 that way. It does not read it that way because it has 81 books and the Western tradition has fewer than 73. The extra books include 1 Enoch, removed from the Western canon by vote at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. They include the Ascension of Isaiah, preserved in complete form only in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition. They include Jubilees, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Synodos, and the Didascalia, along with a commentary tradition that reads Matthew 24 in the context of all of those texts simultaneously. When an Ethiopian Orthodox scholar trained in that tradition encounters Matthew 24 to 36, they are reading it with Enoch chapters 12 through 16 already in their interpretive frame. They know who asked it the first time, and what the record shows came back in response. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, is one of the oldest continuously active Christian institutions in the world. It was founded in the 4th century under King Ezana, who converted Ethiopia to Christianity, making it one of the oldest formally Christian nations on earth. The church holds what it claims is the original Ark of the Covenant in a side chapel called the Treasury, accessible only to a single appointed guardian who does not leave the compound. Whether that specific claim is historically verifiable is a separate inquiry. What is documentable is the manuscript collection the church holds alongside whatever else is in that treasury. The Axum collection is the largest surviving repository of Ge'ez biblical texts. It contains the complete Ethiopian Orthodox scriptural canon in manuscript form, some copies dating to the 14th and 15th centuries, with textual traditions reaching centuries further back than any of those physical copies. The preservation conditions inside the church complex have kept some of these manuscripts in better condition than their age has any right to produce. Among those manuscripts is a complete text of 1 Enoch, the Book of the Watchers. Dr. Michael Knibb's 1978 Oxford translation of 1 Enoch, produced from the Ge'ez manuscript tradition, became the standard scholarly reference most researchers still use as their baseline. Dr. Ephraim Isaac produced a second translation in 1983 for Oxford, working directly from the Axum manuscripts rather than from copies held in external collections. Isaac's translation contains notation marking passages where the Axum text diverges from other surviving Ge'ez manuscript witnesses. The majority of those divergences are minor, a word choice that shifts the shade of a meaning by a fraction. A grammatical construction that is more specific in the Axum version than in copies derived from other textual lines. But in 3 locations in chapters 12, 14, and 16, the Axum text contains material with no equivalent in any other surviving witness to the Enoch tradition in any language. No J's copy held in European collections. No Aramaic fragment from the Dead Sea. No Latin, Greek, or Slavonic version. Those 3 locations correspond exactly to the petition the Watchers sent through Enoch and to the formal record of what the divine proceeding produced in response. Fragment 4, Q 203, stored at the Shrine of the Book within the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, is a piece of parchment approximately the size of a human palm, containing 12 lines of chapter 10 of 1 Enoch in Aramaic. Carbon dating by the Israel Antiquities Authority places it at approximately 150 BCE, making it one of the oldest surviving physical witnesses to the Enochic tradition. At the comparison points where 4Q 203 and the Axum Ge'ez manuscript overlap, the texts align with precision. Aramaic and Ge'ez occupy different branches of the Semitic family tree. They are not related languages. The Enoch tradition traveled through entirely different transmission channels across centuries and arrived at the same content. Dr. James Vanderkam at the University of Notre Dame, among the foremost living authorities on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Enoch literature, has spent decades mapping that convergence. He applied for direct access to the Axum collection in 1988, denied. He applied again in 1997, denied again. In an interview published in Biblical Archaeology Review in 2001, Vanderkam stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references in pre-1974 scholarship, but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. The Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 placed church archives under state classification as national cultural property, and no Western research team has held unrestricted access since. The 3 passages Vanderkam cannot directly verify are in the chapters covering the Watchers' petition and what followed. Before we move on to the question itself, stop for a second. What you just heard about who asked it and why Enoch was chosen as the intermediary is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full Ge'ez passage from chapters 12 through 16. The named petition, the recorded silence. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Chapters 12 through 16 of 1 Enoch form the account of the Watchers' petition, and this is the section the Ethiopian tradition holds in mind when it reads Matthew 24. The 200 Watchers, the angelic beings who descended to Mount Hermon, took human women as companions, fathered the Nephilim, and transmitted to humanity a catalog of arts and knowledge, had been sentenced. God dispatched the archangels to execute the judgment. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel hand and foot and throw him into darkness in the Judean wilderness. Michael was sent to bind Shemiyaza and his associates beneath the earth for 70 generations. Gabriel was dispatched to incite the Nephilim against one another until they destroyed themselves through warfare. The sentences were in motion. The Watchers, unable to halt the proceeding, retained one option. They asked Enoch to carry their petition before God. Chapter 12-3 records God speaking to Enoch before the petition was even submitted, telling him to go to the Watchers and declare that their petition would not be received and that they would have no peace. The refusal precedes the reading. The outcome is stated before the document arrives at the court, and yet the process continues, because the process is the record. Enoch sits by the waters of Dan, near Hermon, reads the petition back to himself, and falls into sleep. In that sleep, he is taken to the divine throne room in a vision. Chapter 14 describes what he saw. The account is the most architecturally specific description of the divine presence in any Jewish text predating the Common Era. Outer walls of white crystal, inner walls of fire, a floor of snow beneath which rivers of living fire run, a ceiling of stars and lightning. At the center, a throne from which light proceeds so intensely that Enoch cannot see the figure within it. He falls on his face. God speaks from within the light. Chapter 15-3 opens the formal verdict. You were holy, spiritual beings living an eternal life, but you defiled yourselves through the daughters of men, polluting yourselves with their blood. Chapter 15-7 addresses the offspring. The giants born of spirit and flesh shall, after their deaths, become evil spirits upon the earth. Chapter 15-8 specifies what those spirits retain and what they cannot do. They afflict, oppress, attack, and destroy upon the earth, but they eat nothing and drink nothing and cannot be seen. The verdict on the watcher's sentence and on the nature of what their offspring become in death is delivered with the completeness of a formal ruling. Every element the petition raised on those two questions receives a stated response. Then comes chapter 16. And in the Axum manuscript, documented in Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation notations and referenced in correspondence he later archived at the University of Manchester, chapter 16 contains a passage between what Western editions render as verses 1 and 2 that has no equivalent in any other surviving version of the Enoch tradition in any language. The passage records a third element of the petition, distinct from the watcher's personal appeal and distinct from the question of the offspring's condition after death. This third element was presented specifically by Azazel. He is identified in chapter 8-1 as the watcher who taught men to make weapons of iron and bronze, who taught women the arts of ornamentation, who revealed the signs of the earth and the signs of the sun and the hidden measures of the heavens. Azazel's element of the petition asks one question the other elements did not address. The question is about the knowledge itself. Will what we gave them be taken from them when the judgment comes, or will it remain with them? The Axum text records no answer to that question. The narrative moves from the question to the next verse without the syntactical formula the Ge'ez scribal tradition uses to introduce a divine response. In the manuscript conventions of this tradition, the absence of that formula is not created by damage or textual loss. It is how a scribe records that no response was delivered. The question was posed within the formal proceeding. The proceeding moved forward without producing the language that would mark a response. The question about the fate of the transmitted knowledge, about whether humanity's possession of what the watchers gave would survive the judgment being executed against them, received from the divine proceeding of chapter 16 the same thing it received when a different form of the question was asked again in Judea. Nothing. The selection of Enoch as the petition's carrier deserves close attention because the Ge'ez tradition is more explicit about his legal function than any Western equivalent ever was. Chapter 12-4 identifies Enoch with the Ge'ez designation, captivate tzedekah. In the Ethiopian liturgical and legal framework, this is not an honorific attached to a holy man. It is a functional designation. A captivate is a scribe whose documents are admissible as instruments in a formal proceeding. The modifier side Q places that function within the celestial administrative structure, rather than any earthly legal system. Enoch is not described in this passage as a prophet or a visionary or a spiritual intermediary. He is described as a recorder whose filings are received as valid documents by the divine court. The watcher's decision to route their petition through Enoch was a procedural calculation, not an act of desperation. They needed an intermediary whose document the court would accept and enter into the record. Enoch was the only human being at that point in the text with that standing. Chapter 15-1 confirms this directly when God addresses Enoch as the righteous man and the truthful scribe before the petition's contents are considered. The standing is acknowledged before the hearing proceeds. Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed, whose 2005 monograph Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity traces the reception of the Watcher narrative across Jewish and early Christian textual traditions, specifically describes the Ethiopian Enoch tradition's treatment of the petition exchange as bureaucratic. She uses that word without apology, writing that the Ge'ez text approaches the petition and its outcome as an administrative transaction with a formal record of result rather than as mythological drama with symbolic content. That characterization has consequences for how the gap in chapter 16 should be read. An administrative proceeding either contains a response to a specific question or it does not. The Axum manuscript records a formal proceeding in which one question received no response. The pattern of the formally unanswered question about transmitted knowledge and its fate appears in two other ancient scribal traditions, and the precision of the parallel across those traditions is not comfortable to explain away. The Egyptian record holds the first parallel. In the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, preserved most completely at Saqqara, in the pyramid complex of Unas, dated to approximately 2375 BCE, utterances 273 and 274 form the text Egyptologists call the Cannibal Hymn, a formal ritual text describing the ascending king, questioning the divine beings in sequence. Each being responds. When the questioning reaches Thoth in his function as the divine scribe, the hieroglyphic text employs a formula that Dr. James Allen, whose 2005 translation of the pyramid text for the Society of Biblical Literature is the standard scholarly reference, identifies in a footnote as Tata en Medu Neferu. This is administrative notation in the Egyptian scribal tradition, the specific phrase used to record that a response was formally withheld rather than simply absent. The question directed to Thoth concerns the provenance and tenure of the recorded knowledge, the origin of what the divine scribe administers and holds. The text records that he withheld his response to that specific question. The divine scribe's silence was preserved as a silence, carved into stone, not absence. Documented non-response. The Babylonian record runs through the Anzu fragment, the clay tablet recovered during Leonard Woolley's 1924 excavations at Ur and subsequently lost from the formal archaeological catalog. No accession number was ever assigned to it. It does not appear in any published record of the Ur excavations. The only surviving photographic evidence from the 1924 field season is a partially obscured image captioned "Not for reproduction." Dr. Nadia Voss, at the Free University of Berlin, completed a translation of approximately 70% of the tablet's content in 2021, working from high-resolution photographs of a rubbing made in 1938 by Harold Spicer at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, whose notes survived misfiled in the archive until 1987. The surviving 70% of the text records a first-person account of 9 observable signs preceding a catastrophic event the Sumerian compound identifies as an Abzubala, which Voss translates as "the day the upper deep opened." The text is grammatically structured as testimony rather than prophecy, written in past tense by someone recording what they witnessed and survived. Within the surviving portion, the author poses a question about the transmitted knowledge, whether the beings who gave it intended for it to outlast them, whether humanity's possession of what was transmitted is permanent or provisional. The section of the tablet that would contain any response to that question falls in the compressed and damaged lower third, where the original firing process collapsed symbols beyond current imaging recovery. Voss has been working on that portion for 3 years. No response has been recovered from the damaged section. 3 traditions: the Ge'ez manuscript in Axum, the hieroglyphic text at Saqqara, the clay tablet from Ur. 3 formal scribal records in 3 unrelated writing systems, from 3 civilizations without documented contact at the relevant periods. Each one records a question about the origin and fate of transmitted knowledge addressed to a divine or semi-divine figure who administers the record of what is known. Each one preserves, where the answer should appear, an absence. Why the Western Christian tradition does not have any of this context is documentable rather than conjectural. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE issued Canon 59, prohibiting the reading of non-canonical texts in church assemblies, and Canon 60, listing which texts were excluded. Enoch was among them. The language in the Council's own record explains the concern, as the text's excessive specificity about the names, stations, and prison locations of fallen angels. The Council did not dispute that fallen angels existed. What the Council prohibited was the specificity. A text that names individual beings, assigns them to specific crimes, places their prisons in locations with directional and material detail, and preserves the formal record of a divine proceeding, including an unanswered question, is a text that can be investigated and compared against other records. The Church chose a canon, in which that investigation could not be conducted through the Scripture itself. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, wrote that Enoch's claims about the structure of angelic imprisonment were unverifiable and therefore inappropriate for canonical inclusion. Not false. Unverifiable. The Ethiopian tradition drew the opposite conclusion from the same premise. If the text is specific enough to investigate, that specificity is its value. If it can be compared against material from other traditions, that comparability is the reason to keep it. The Ethiopian Church's decision to retain Enoch while the Western churches prohibited it was not a failure of theological rigor. It was a different answer to the question of what rigor requires. Augustine, in City of God, around 410 CE, argued that the Watcher material should be read as moral allegory, the angelic figures representing the corruption of rational nature by carnal desire. The petition narrative in chapters 12 through 16 resists that reading. Symbolic figures representing moral categories do not engage human scribes as legal intermediaries in formal administrative proceedings. They do not receive comprehensive rulings on named charges and then present a follow-up question about a specific category of material they transmitted. The text behaves like a court transcript, with a documented gap. Augustine chose to read it as extended metaphor. When James Bruce carried 3 Ge'ez manuscripts from Axum to Europe in 1773, the petition chapters attracted almost no scholarly attention, relative to the more visually striking sections about the Nephilim and the prison architecture. R. H. Charles's 1000 906 English translation, which became the baseline reference for 17 subsequent editions of Enoch in English, condensed the petition narrative and did not include the Axum passage containing the third element and the recorded silence, because Charles was working from a manuscript tradition that had never contained it. He had no reason to note an omission he could not see. Dr. Gabriele Boccaccini, director of the Enoch Seminar at the University of Michigan and one of the central figures in contemporary Enoch scholarship, has written about what he identifies as the epistemological crisis at the heart of the Enochic tradition. The tradition exists to explain where the knowledge came from. It never resolves what should be done with it now. The Watchers are sentenced. The Nephilim are destroyed. The knowledge remains. The question of the transmitted knowledge's fate is the question the tradition builds toward and never closes. Boccaccini frames this as a theological problem the literature could not resolve. The Axum passage makes it something more specific. It makes it a procedural gap in a formal record. The question is there. The answer is not. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition holds those two moments together as a single continuous thread because it has the books that make the connection visible. The Western tradition has Matthew. The Ethiopian tradition has Matthew and Enoch and 74 other texts that frame who was asking and why no answer came back then any more than it came back in the divine proceeding of chapter 16. Matthew 24-36 is not a standalone theological declaration about divine humility. It is the most recent entry in an administrative record that began when the Watchers transmitted their knowledge to humanity and left embedded in that transmission an unresolved question about whether the transmission was authorized. Every tradition that seriously engaged this material, the Egyptian at Saqqara, the Babylonian at Ur, the Judean at Qumran, and at Axum, recorded the moment when that question was posed to whoever held the answer. Each one recorded what came back. The Axum manuscripts are still in Ethiopia. Access applications filed in 1988 and 1997 are on record as denied. The 3 Jez lines in chapter 16 that no published English edition of Enoch contains are still in the manuscript. Fragment 4Q 203 is still in Jerusalem at the shrine of the book. The gap in chapter 16 where the answering formula does not appear is still there, readable in the gaze, documented in Isaac's 1983 translation notations, referenced in the correspondence archived at Manchester, and absent from every edition the Western scholarly tradition has produced. The question was asked in a formal proceeding. It was asked again on a hillside in Judea. Neither time did an answer come back. And the record of both silences is still in Axum, behind the walls of a church that has not granted unrestricted access to outside researchers in more than 50 years, in a tradition that has always known what was asked, and what it means that no answer ever came.